John
Okay.
Wisely, reporter for the Detroit Free Press. You've helmed the Where Secrets Go to Die podcast that just wrapped up behind the paywall. It's about to go to streaming. It's essentially about just a man who went missing from the Newberry area a little over a decade ago. Uh, can you flesh out some more of the essential details of this story?
Sure. So the man's name is Derrick Henagan, and he grew up in kind of southwest Lower Michigan, Hartford, kind of about 30 miles southwest of Kalamazoo. He moved to the UP, moved to Newberry area, McMillan, in late '07, early '08. We haven't quite pinpointed the date, but he was selling cars up there. Took up with a local woman, Diana Maddox, and they moved in together. And they had kind of a stormy relationship. The cops have been out to the house a couple of times for domestic abuse complaints, things like that. And they both had, well, he had definitely at that time some troubles. He'd been a drug user and he'd had some legal troubles. Then in August of '08, he disappeared. He and Diana were having a fight on a Friday, and he left for the weekend and went down the road to some friends who lived, maybe 400 or 500 yards down the road, and stayed there for the weekend. And he was supposed to come back to meet her on Monday, and he never made it. So that's kind of where the mystery begins. Is what happened to him from the time he left the house down the road to the time he got to where he was supposed to be, or did he ever leave? So that's kind of the mystery of it. But then there's a lot more to it as well. I mean, it's there's I think you've listened to the podcast, so you've heard some of it. There are some questions about the way the state police have handled this investigation. They didn't search either of those houses. They didn't interview some key witnesses until years later, and then there was a thought that one of their own, a trooper by the name of David Mogenberg, could be involved. And so in the podcast, we dug into that pretty deeply. We talked to his family members. We talked to his daughter, who reported some kind of disturbing things that she'd seen from him. We talked to both of his ex-wives, who reported some pretty violent domestic abuse. We were able to get some records from the Michigan State Police related to him. And when we got him back, there was more than 400 pages of internal affairs reports related to him. So that kind of, prompted a lot of suspicion along with some other things. And that's what we delve into in the podcast.
And I want to say two or three times through the series, you mentioned that this is a story you felt like you had to tell, or it was a pet project. Can you elaborate a little more on that, why that is?
Sure. It's a story that took a very long time to tell. We had, I think people up in Upper Michigan may remember, there was a kind of a sensational crime in April 2015. There was a triple murder in Manistee. There was two young women, Heather Aldrich and her sister, Carrie Nelson, and Carrie Nelson's boyfriend, a man named Jody Hutchinson. They were all killed, and their bodies were thrown into an SUV. The SUV was driven out into the woods near Manistee and set on fire. And so, and that was a pretty sensational crime at the time. And they were drug users. Heather had been involved in sex work a couple months before. So it was, these are people from tough circumstances. And so a couple colleagues of mine came up to the UP to do a Sunday story on that. It was just a traditional newspaper story. And so we wrote that story, and it was, a look at, and the way that case was handled. There were some questions about the prosecution in that case. And it was, I think a lot of people out there might remember it. But after that story published, we got a call. We got a tip actually from this trooper's daughter that she said, I think there's more here than just that triple murder. I think there are some other things connected to it. And so we started picking away at that, and we learned about Trooper Mogenberg. We learned about some of the other things, and then we learned about a big element of this has been kind of the online presence of it. So there was Derrick Henagan, the man who went missing, was on bond when he disappeared, and so the bond company conducted their own search trying to find him because they lost their money to the court. And a bail bondswoman named Jody Newman really dug deep into it. And she has this Facebook page that has, more than 3,000 followers who watch this case. She's interviewed a lot of the suspects, people in and around the case. And there's been a lot of chatter on her Facebook page about it. So all of that kind of intrigued us. And among the things she did was she also tape recorded interviews with people very close to it. Diana Maddox, a couple of members of Diana's family, some other people. And she gave us those tapes. So we're trying to figure out, how do we tell this story? And because of that audio, these tapes, and some other things, we thought it would make a good podcast. It would have a little more value if people could hear the voices rather than just read the words in the paper. And so that's how we started out turning it into a podcast. And we went to the UP actually in late 19 and early 20 to do some interviews. And then, of course, in March, we were actually in Newberry in March of 2020 for a court hearing. And then 2 weeks later, the state shut down with COVID. So we couldn't really do much with this story, and it kind of just got back burnered for a while myself and everybody else at the Free Press just covered COVID for a couple of years. So it was just kind of sitting back there, and it was like, gosh, we still want to tell this story. And some of the people, I don't want to spoil all the podcasts, but one of the people we interview in the story later died of COVID, and so it was a tough story to tell. But after learning all the things we learned, especially early on, I didn't want COVID to kind of kill this story either, because we could have just moved on and said, you know what, it's old news now, and let's keep going, into new things. And we didn't. We to the Free Press's undying credit, they allowed me to continue to pursue it. We did it in audio format, which allowed us to use these tapes, let people hear these voices, and as a result of that, we've got the first real true narrative investigative podcast in Free Press history. So we're proud of that.
Wow. And we touched on, I think, most of the characters. You just mentioned the bounty hunter. There's also, we start the series with Mike Niger, the body hunter as well. We touched on Diana Maddox, Trooper Mogenberg. Is there anybody else essential to this narrative that we haven't yet?
I will flush out Mike Niger a little bit, because he was one of the most fascinating characters we'd met, and he spent 25 years with the Michigan State Police, had been a detective, worked mostly in the crime lab, examining forensic evidence. And but he was always this guy from up north who loved to be outdoors in the woods. He's been a wilderness guide for decades. And I think he's 70 now, but he literally works out 6 days a week at Northern Michigan, swims laps, does all this other stuff. He's in, a lot better shape than I am. And I'm a lot younger than he is. But he created this group to help find people who are basically lost in the woods. Some of these people may have been out hunting, and you got, had some kind of health issue. They may have been, some people go out in the woods to end their own lives. Other people may have been dumped there by, maybe murdered or overdosed and dumped there. And so he's developed this really weird skill set where he's able to track people through the woods and find them. Everybody leaves a little bit of a trail, and he's really good at following those. So he was just to us a fascinating character, and he's interesting too because he's a former trooper. He has real insight into the Michigan State Police, and he's not been shy about his criticism of the way they handled this case. He kind of pleads for the FBI or some outside agency to come in and look at it and see if there isn't more that could be done with it. I'm going to grab a drink here. So he was a super fascinating character. Other main characters, I think that's about it. You got Derrick and Diana, who were the couple. You've got Jody, who is the bail bondswoman, Mike Niger, that we refer to as the body hunter, which is what he does. And then you've got just, some other people as well. We talked to a lot of people who, a lot of the people involved in this story, from the triple murder to Derrick, to Diana. A lot of them were kind of involved in the drug world in the UP, and so we spent some time talking to a lot of people in that world too. And it was eye-opening in some ways. Some of those you'll hear from some of those people in the podcast, not a ton of them, but yeah, that's been real eye-opening for us.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's really one of the core themes of the show, right? Is small town drug culture and the opioid epidemic, family trauma, police accountability. That last one, and we've talked a bit about it with Mr. Niger and Mogenberg. How does that tie in? What's the big takeaway for you on the police accountability aspect?
So it's it's hard to tell. I mean, there were these suspicions raised about Mogenberg, and to be clear before we say anything, um, we're not saying anybody did this. We don't have definitive proof that any of these people were involved. Nobody's ever been charged, let alone convicted. So under our system, they're all considered presumed innocent. And so, the when Mogenberg's name was brought into this, there was some kind of really suspicious activity by the Michigan State Police, and I don't know if that was just they were embarrassed because of some of the things that came out about him, or if there's something larger at play. But we felt it was important to inquire. Even when we would request records from the state police, the way they would redact it was interesting. They would redact things that kind of led to Mogenberg. And, again, is that a privacy issue? Is that a public image issue? Is that we're trying to solve the case issue? It's, the case has lingered for 15 years and they've never charged anyone. So I don't know that it's the latter, but it's, and then, like I said, 400 pages of internal affairs reports on this cop. And he's interesting because he was the first cop to the house on the day Derrick disappeared. He didn't actually take the missing persons report. He was there on another complaint, and then 3 days later, the missing person report was filed. But he was there the day Derrick disappeared, and so that's why he's always been so close to it. And we thought it was important to examine that, to look into his background. When we saw his internal affairs files, we saw, a lot of a troubled guy. And when we talked to his families, that's when we really got this picture of a violent man, which raises the scepter that, yeah, could he be involved? His family actually believes that there's a high likelihood he was involved. We're not saying that because we haven't been able to conclusively prove that, but we can prove pretty conclusively that he had a violent history and some very strange behavior for a state trooper.
Yeah, and I think the name, doesn't lead us down any false roads. There are no easy answers at the end of your reporting. It's really where secrets go to die. How have you seen the lack of answers weigh on the different people involved?
It's That's a great question because it's so you've got this bounty hunter that we talked about, Jody Newman, and she became very close friends with Derrick, the missing man's mother, and she really wanted to find out what happened to Derrick for the sake of his mother, and his mother has since passed, so she never got that answer. And the people we talked to around her said it tormented her to the end of her days. I mean, it really was difficult to have your son disappear and then no answer. You don't know if he was killed or he killed himself or if he wandered off or he's still alive somewhere. I mean, no one believes he's alive because he was the kind of guy who talked to people every day, and they just don't believe he could be silent for that long. So he's and then a court ruled him dead in 2013, I think it was. It was about 6 years after he disappeared. So it's weighed a lot on Jody. But then one of the interviews we got kind of late in the process was his son, a young man named Race, who was just a really good interview. He's 21 now. Wait a second. Excuse me. Race is 21 now, and he was 6 when his dad disappeared. So he doesn't really remember a whole lot about his dad. And he's never gotten answers either. And he would really love to know what happened to his dad. And he just feels like it's this unanswered question. And so he's a really impressive young guy. He works hard. He's a mechanic, does a lot of body shop repair. And he said he likes to work a lot because it keeps his mind off of things. And I think in his private moments, he probably does, his thoughts return to, what happened to my dad. And so there's another woman people will meet in there by the name of Missy Carriage. Melissa Carriage, she lives in Germfask area, and she lost a daughter to kind of the whole drug crisis there too. And she's followed this case, and she knew some of the players in it too. And she still carries that burden every day too. I mean, it was a tough. Her daughter got mixed up in drugs and then eventually in sex work, which is, often follows. And so she carries that kind of burden every day too. And it's tough. And those were some of the big motivations for us to do this story too, was to kind of tell those people's story. And it's, I mean, sadly, there's a lot of people go missing every year. But behind every one of them is a family and friends and others who knew them, who are just left with, what happened? Where did my loved one go? And so that was one of the things we really wanted to try to amplify the voice of those people.
And I guess looking for, is there any hope for resolution? I guess what answers could still be found out.
That's kind of where we end it. And there's Mike Niger believes there is still a chance, because he thinks there's some physical evidence that hasn't been properly examined that could yield some clues. Ultimately, um, the best thing that could happen would be for them to find Derrick's remains, because they would tell a story in themselves. And but they've never been able to find those, and they've searched quite a bit. Niger's searched a bunch of swamps. We searched some properties up there and some wooded areas based on tips. Um, but nobody's ever been able to find his remains, and that would be, the single best thing you could find. You could also find, theoretically, you could get an eyewitness. I mean, the thought is, if something happened to Derrick and people had to get rid of his remains, that would be a tough job for one person to do. So the question is, who else was involved? What was their involvement? What was their motivation? Did they, would they at some point talk because they need to, because they're in trouble and they're looking to get out of trouble? So there is still hope that it could be solved, but it's 15 years and the memories fade. Some of the, like I said, one of the people we spoke to died of COVID, so he's no longer around to be a witness. And some others, are getting on in years. So it's tough, but we're hopeful that if the right person came forward, or the right piece of evidence was uncovered, that they could still get it all.
Another aspect that I thought was really interesting in your storytelling was the role of the online community, the Where
Yes.
is Derrick Henagan? Do I have that name correct? Where is that the name of the Facebook page?
Yeah, it's called Where's Derrick Henagan? No apostrophe on the where's, but Where's Derrick Henagan? And so that was Jody Newman, the bounty hunter, had started that years ago. And so it's become this kind of community forum on the case. And it's also become, a community forum to complain about things. And, I mean, anytime you get the public talking, you get all kinds of different voices heard on there. But it's amazing um, how much chatter has been on there, and how many people very close to the case have been willing to weigh in that forum. And so, for us as reporters, we read all that, of course, but then you're trying to verify that. If somebody said this happened, is there a police report to show that? Is there a secondary witness to show that? Is there some other form of evidence that, to confirm that? And that's one of the reasons it took a long time. It's really hard to untangle that, and there's been so much discussion that it's really difficult. And like I mentioned, that what started it all, that whole triple murder, there's been a whole kind of community dialogue about that case as well, and that factors into it too. So it's, I've even asked the police about that. Does having that forum out there, does that make it harder to solve a case or easier or what? And I can't get a conclusive answer. They say, there's, um, when they interview somebody, they want to know where this person got this information. Did they just read it online, or were they a firsthand witness, or did they see something or talk to someone? And so they've had to kind of parse all that. But they also, some police I've talked to said, it can be helpful because some people will be emboldened to give a tip in that kind of environment that they wouldn't necessarily give in another type of environment. And so police have definitely looked at some of the things that have been on there and tracked them down, tried to track them down, tried to confirm them.
And by the time this conversation airs, the podcast will be available on all streaming platforms where you can find podcasts.
Yeah. Yes, it's currently available on freep.com, and as of the 14th of May, it will be available on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, and pretty much anywhere else you get your podcast. You can just search for Where Secrets Go to Die, and it should pop up.
Gotcha. Anything else you want to share about the podcast and your reporting?
For me, it's been a new experience. I'm an old dog. I've done mostly print journalism in my life, so doing audio was different. But given the material we had, I'm really glad we did it in audio format, and I think the listeners will appreciate the audio format in a way that it just couldn't be gathered strictly in written words alone. So yeah, it's been a real, like I said, a real passion project of mine. Was glad to get it through COVID and glad to have it out there. I sincerely hope that it shakes something loose and that maybe we get some answers for those people who wonder what happened to Derrick Henagan.
Yeah. And it really is very well put together. It was a pleasure to listen through and hear your story, especially with how I think you can hear through your narration and how the story was put together, how difficult it was to make all the pieces fit.
Right.
Um, yeah, I guess could you talk a little bit about that process of where you
Sure.
came into the story and then how you began to orient just yourself in the
Sure.
story and figure out how it made sense to you?
Sure. It was new for me because as I mentioned, I've done exclusively, written words for over the course of my career. And I've always reported in sort of a traditional newspaper style. There's more of me in this than you would find in my print work. You'll hear me reflecting on an interview I've just had. You'll hear me, thinking out loud about something that, how do I connect this with that? And normally I do that on every story, but normally I do that kind of privately. But because of the sort of intimate uh, way that audio works, one of the things we decided early on in this podcast reporting was let's bring the listener along on the podcast on the reporting journey. And so that's why, we've tried to, when we took a tour of Derrick's hometown, we wanted it to sound like the listener was in the back seat of the car that's given us the tour. When we go to court, we want them to feel like they're sitting in the courtroom just as we are. And so we had to learn some new storytelling techniques. We had people who helped us do that. But it was definitely new for us. And it was, like I said, it was I really enjoyed it. I struggled with it at the beginning, but then I came to embrace it. And like I said, I just think given the material we had, this story was just crying out for audio treatment. And when people dial it up and they hear these voices, you hear a voicemail from David Mogenberg. You hear, stuff like that. The one voice we didn't have that I regret was Derrick Henagan's. We'd hoped like his family had, you know, movies, home movies or something that might have included his voice. We were not able to get that. So that's one voice that's sort of missing. But finding these voices, piecing them together, and trying to put it all into context, like, with the triple murder and the small town drug culture and the police questions and the case itself, it was a real challenge. But when it was done, a little over 50,000 words, which is by far the largest project of my career. And but I'm proud of it. I think it tells a good story, and I hope people will enjoy it.
Yeah, and it's available everywhere Tuesday, but
That's great.
yeah, it's been out behind the paywall for some time now. What's the response been? Yeah, what have you been hearing as the episodes have been coming out over the past few weeks?
Yeah, you know, we and I should clarify on the rollout. So we started out with the first three episodes, and then we waited 1 week to roll out each of the next five episodes. And we'll do that again starting tomorrow. We'll do three will be released, and then it'll be 1 week on the streaming platforms. So, but yeah, it's been a we've heard some really interesting, feedback. I've gotten emails from people up in the UP. I've heard from other people who maybe didn't know this case specifically, but they maybe knew some of the players. They hear names they recognize, they hear places they recognize. As you know, the UP is a collection of small towns, and so people in these places know one another, and they know that person's brother or cousin or something like that. So it's been really interesting to hear from just ordinary folks in the community. We've talked to some others. The Newberry News has their own newspaper, and they've been interested in it. So yeah, it's been really interesting to hear, and I'm hoping that that feedback goes up once it becomes on the public platforms, because I think it has a chance to reach more ears, and hopefully more people who know some of the principles. I did get just the other day, I got a voicemail from a prisoner in Ohio, and it's weird. I've had a couple prisoners reach out to me, and I haven't been able to figure out how they're connected to the case. So I think they're mostly interested in me doing something on their case. But it's very interesting. You don't know whose ears you're going to hit, and you don't know who's going to reach out. So that's been part of the fun.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I'm excited to see how the rest of the community, picks it up in the next few weeks as the episodes roll out. But yeah, thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Shiloh. I really do appreciate it, and thanks for what you do too. It's that's another thing we've tried to point out is journalism is in kind of a precarious state right now, and it's hard to do long-term projects and deep dives like this. And so when we're given the luxury to do that, we feel really grateful. And we hope people up there and everywhere support not only the free press, but all their local media, because those are the people who are going to tell your stories.